They humiliated Shaq's wife, treating her like she was nobody, until they found out who her husband was. But Shaq didn't just get payback. He changed the game forever. A billionaire's silent power move, a scandal that rocked the elite, and a lesson they never saw coming. This isn't just revenge, it's a legacy. Are you ready for the twist? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The midday sun shimmered over the Lancaster Grand, one of the most exclusive five-star hotels in the country. A symbol of wealth, prestige, and old money privilege, the towering structure gleamed with its glass-paneled exterior, and a fleet of luxury cars lined its entrance. At the hotel's grand revolving doors, Shawnee Henderson O'Neill stepped out of her sleek black Bentley Flying Spur, dressed in an elegant yet understated designer jumpsuit, her sunglasses shielding her eyes as she took in the sight. She had been to countless luxury resorts, yet something about this place felt different, not in its extravagance, but in its atmosphere. She adjusted the strap of her Chanel handbag, pulling her designer carry-on behind her. It was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation and self-care, a break from the constant spotlight of being Big Shaq's wife. For once, she just wanted to enjoy a trip as herself, not as someone's spouse, not as a celebrity figure. But as soon as she stepped inside, she felt it, that invisible shift in the air. Not warmth, not hospitality, judgment. Behind the ornate check-in counter, Charles Wentworth III stood with his usual air of superiority. His silver-streaked hair was slicked back, his uniform was pristine, and his expression was one of calculated scrutiny. Charles had worked at the Lancaster Grand for over 20 years, priding himself on his ability to assess clientele at first glance. To him, guests fell into two categories, those who belonged and those who did not. The moment he laid eyes on Shawnee, he made his decision. His cold, assessing gaze drifted over her, lingering just long enough to suggest he wasn't convinced. She stepped forward, offering a polite but confident smile. "Good afternoon. I have a reservation under Shawnee Henderson O'Neill." Charles barely glanced at the screen before speaking. "The presidential suite?" His tone carried a hint of disbelief, as if he were correcting an error. "Yes," Shawnee said smoothly, unfazed. "Booked for the weekend." Charles hesitated just a second too long before responding. "I see." He exhaled through his nose, his lips curving slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile, more like a smirk of polite condescension. Shawnee knew this expression well. It was the look of someone who didn't think she belonged. Charles took longer than necessary to pull up the reservation, his fingers moving leisurely over the keyboard. Every few seconds, he stole another glance at Shawnee, his expression barely masking his doubt. She remained patient. She had been in situations like this before, the unspoken but ever-present message that she wasn't the kind of woman people expected in spaces like these. Finally, Charles cleared his throat. "Mrs. O'Neill, I'm sure you understand, but we typically reserve the presidential suite for our most distinguished guests, longtime patrons, corporate executives, dignitaries." Shawnee arched an eyebrow. "And?" Charles forced a tight smile. "I just want to ensure there hasn't been a mix-up." Shawnee inhaled slowly. There it was. Not an outright denial. Just enough hesitation. Just enough doubt. Just enough to remind her that some doors were still harder to walk through. She calmly reached into her handbag, pulled out her printed confirmation email, and placed it on the counter with a delicate tap. "Maybe this will help clear up the confusion." Charles's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He scanned the email, his jaw tightening slightly as he realized there was nothing he could dispute. The reservation was real. The payment had been processed. She belonged here. But instead of acknowledging his mistake, he simply nodded stiffly. "Very well," he said, reaching for the key card. "I'll have someone escort you shortly." Shawnee didn't break eye contact. She didn't need to say anything. She had already won. As Charles handed Shawnee's check-in folder to a bellhop, another guest stepped up to the counter. A middle-aged white man, dressed in golf attire, placed his credit card on the counter without a word. "Presidential suite," he said casually. Charles's demeanor transformed instantly. "Ah, Mr. Whitmore," he greeted enthusiastically, his voice warming several degrees. "Welcome back. It's always a pleasure to have you with us." Shawnee watched as the same man who had questioned her reservation didn't even ask for Mr. Whitmore's ID. No hesitation, no skepticism, just pure, effortless hospitality. She picked up her keycard and turned to leave, but not before locking eyes with Charles one last time. The contrast was painfully obvious, and Charles knew it. He gave her a curt nod. "Enjoy your stay, Mrs. O'Neill." Shawnee smiled. "Oh, I will." And with that, she walked toward the private elevator, leaving behind a butler who had no idea. His worst mistake was assuming he knew who she was. As Shawnee disappeared into the elevator, Charles leaned toward a fellow staff member. "Did you see that?" he muttered, shaking his head. "I give it a few hours before we get a service complaint." The younger staff member chuckled nervously. "You think she'll make a fuss?" Charles smirked. "They always do." He adjusted his sleeves, still smug in his belief that he had handled the situation well. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that this wasn't just any guest. This wasn't just another wealthy traveler. Because the man she was married to wasn't just rich, he was Big Shaq. And when Shaq found out what had just happened, the Lancaster Grand would never be the same again. The evening skyline of Los Angeles stretched endlessly, the city lights flickering like scattered diamonds against the darkening sky. Inside a penthouse suite, Big Shaq sat in his private lounge, scrolling through emails on his phone. His day had been packed: meetings, brand deals, charity initiatives. But now he had finally settled into the quiet of the evening. As he took a sip of water, his phone buzzed. Shawnee. A smile flickered across his face as he answered. "Hey, baby." For a second, there was silence. That wasn't like her. "Shaq." Her voice was calm, but something in her tone made him sit up a little straighter. "What's wrong?" Shawnee exhaled, debating how much to say, how to say it. She didn't want to ruin the night over something she had learned to brush off, but at the same time, it wasn't okay. And she knew if anyone understood that, it was Shaq. "I'm at the hotel," she began carefully. Shaq nodded, shifting in his chair. "Yeah, you like it? They treatin' you good?" A pause. Then, a soft, bitter laugh. "Well, I wouldn't exactly say that." Shaq's brows furrowed. "What you mean?" Shawnee leaned back against the luxurious hotel bed, staring at the ceiling. "The butler," she said finally. "At check-in, he looked me up and down like I was lost." Shaq's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "He questioned my reservation. Said the presidential suite was reserved for distinguished guests. Like I didn't belong here." Shaq didn't say anything. Shawnee sighed, forcing a small chuckle. "I mean, it's nothing new, right? Same old story." Silence. But she knew him. She could hear the way his breathing had changed, the way the air on the other end of the call had gone still. "Shaq?" His voice when he spoke was even. Low. "What's his name?" Shawnee swallowed. "Does it matter?" "What's his name?" She closed her eyes. She hadn't wanted to ignite this fire, but now there was no stopping it. "Charles," she murmured. Shaq didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "I see." And just like that, she knew the decision had been made. As Shaq sat in silence, his mind drifted backward. Years before the fame, the millions, the world knowing his name. He remembered the nights he and Shawnee sat in their tiny apartment, counting just enough money to get by. He remembered the first time they went to a fancy restaurant, how they had saved for weeks just for that one night out. How the waiter barely acknowledged them, speaking only when necessary, treating them like an inconvenience. Shawnee had seen Shaq's frustration and had reached for his hand under the table. "Let it go," she had whispered back then. But he never really had, because he remembered everything. Back in the present, Shaq exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his beard. He wasn't the type to act on impulse. He wasn't reckless. But when it came to his family, his wife, respect, that was different. "I'll handle it," he finally said. Shawnee sighed. "Shaq, I don't want you to..." He cut her off gently. I'm not gonna cause a scene, baby. Pause. But I promise you, he's gonna remember your name. And with that, the storm had begun. The Lancaster Grand had always marketed itself as a sanctuary of luxury, a place where the elite could escape from the ordinary. But behind its polished marble floors, gold-plated elevators, and high-end restaurants, a different reality lurked beneath the surface, one that wasn't visible to the average guest. And Big Shaq was about to uncover it all. The following morning, Shaq arrived at the hotel unannounced. He had booked a suite under a different name, ensuring that no one recognized him as Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend, the businessman, the owner of multiple enterprises. No cameras, no entourage. Just him. Dressed in a well-tailored dark navy suit, he walked through the grand entrance with an unreadable expression, his towering frame impossible to ignore, yet his presence strangely discreet. The receptionist, a young woman in her early 20s, greeted him professionally. Good morning, sir. Welcome to the Lancaster Grand. Do you have a reservation? Shaq handed her his ID and credit card. Yes, under the name Michael Reeves. She typed in the details, her eyes briefly flickering up at him. There was a moment of hesitation, but she quickly masked it with a polite smile. Ah, yes. The executive suite on the 24th floor. I'll get your key right away. Shaq nodded but didn't miss the hesitation. It was subtle, but it was there. He had felt this before. And he was starting to understand why Shawnee's experience wasn't an isolated incident. Instead of heading straight to his suite, Shaq decided to observe. Over the next few hours, he positioned himself in the lobby, the lounge, and the dining areas, watching, listening. It didn't take long for him to see it, the pattern. Guests who looked like him, Black, Latino, or from other minority backgrounds, were often met with hesitation, forced smiles, and unnecessary questions before receiving their room keys. White guests checked in without issue. No hesitation, no second guessing. In the hotel restaurant, he noticed how certain tables were offered better seating, faster service, and more attentive staff, while others, especially those occupied by Black guests, were placed near the kitchen, overlooked, or subtly rushed. When a Black couple requested a late checkout, the concierge declined, saying it was against policy. An hour later, a wealthy white businessman made the same request, and it was granted. Shaq clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about Shawnee. This was systemic. And at the heart of it all, the butler, Charles. Shaq managed to strike up a conversation with a lower-level staff member, a bellhop named Derek, who had been working at the hotel for 3 years. After a bit of casual talk, Shaq steered the conversation toward Charles. Derek hesitated before speaking, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear. Charles has been here forever, he muttered. He's got connections. People have complained before, but nothing ever happens. Shaq narrowed his eyes. What kind of complaints? Derek sighed. Rude behavior, talking down to people, making certain guests feel unwelcome. He shook his head. We all know how he is, but management backs him up, every time. Shaq's jaw tightened. Why? Derek lowered his voice. Because of Dalton. Shaq sat up slightly. Dalton? Derek nodded. Richard Dalton, the general manager. He protects Charles. Thinks the hotel should maintain a certain image. Shaq let those words sink in. So there it was. Charles wasn't acting alone. He was protected by a bigger problem. Richard Dalton, a man who didn't just allow discrimination but encouraged it. Richard Dalton was everything Shaq expected him to be. In his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair slicked back, he dressed in custom-tailored suits, his cufflinks engraved with his initials, RD. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. Shaq spotted him in the lobby, speaking with a high-profile guest, all charm and fake smiles. But then, a staff member approached him with a concern about a guest complaint. Dalton's face immediately darkened. This is the Lancaster Grand, Dalton snapped in a low, cutting voice. We do not cater to everyone. Shaq's fingers curled into a fist. There it was, the truth beneath the surface. Dalton wasn't just tolerating discrimination. He was enforcing it. Shaq could have walked straight up to Dalton and confronted him. He could have called Shawnee, told her to go public, let the media tear this place apart overnight. But that wasn't his style. This wasn't just about exposing a racist butler. This was about exposing the entire system, and that required strategy. Shaq booked a private meeting with Richard Dalton under the pretense of discussing a business partnership. Dalton, not recognizing who he was, immediately agreed. "We always welcome high-value partnerships," Dalton had said over the phone. "Let's discuss over dinner tomorrow night." Shaq smirked. Perfect, but he wasn't coming alone. The next morning, Shaq made another call. This one wasn't to a business partner. It was to a journalist. A trusted reporter from a major news outlet, someone who had covered stories of racial discrimination in elite spaces before. "I need you to be in the hotel tomorrow night," Shaq said. "Be ready to listen." The journalist didn't hesitate. "What am I listening for?" Shaq's expression hardened. "The truth." And with that, the trap was set. Shaq had the pieces in place. Dalton thought this was a routine meeting. Charles had no idea Shaq was even in the hotel. The journalist would be listening, recording. Would Dalton expose himself? Would Charles get caught in his own arrogance? One thing was certain. By the time Shaq was done, the Lancaster Grand would never be the same again. The Lancaster Grand was alive with its usual luxury. Crystal chandeliers casting golden reflections on the marble floors, expensive colognes lingering in the air, and soft classical music playing from hidden speakers. The hotel prided itself on exclusivity, where only the world's elite could move freely, assured that they were in the presence of their own kind. And now, Big Shaq was walking straight into it. But no one knew. Not yet. A blacked-out luxury SUV pulled up to the grand entrance, its tires rolling to a slow stop on the red carpet driveway. The doorman rushed forward, assuming it was another celebrity, a billionaire, or perhaps a politician. The back door opened and out stepped a towering figure in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his broad shoulders making the valet's breath hitch for just a second. Shaq adjusted the gold watch on his wrist, his expression unreadable. He had walked into thousands of luxury hotels before, but never like this. Today, he wasn't Big Shaq, the NBA legend, the businessman, the media personality. Today, he was just another guest. And he wanted to see exactly how they would treat him. At the reception desk, Charles Wentworth III was in his usual form. His silver hair neatly combed back, his tailored uniform perfectly pressed, his face wearing that ever-present look of condescending authority. He stood by as a young couple, a black man in a sharp suit and his wife in an elegant dress, approached the counter. "Checking in for the executive suite," the man said politely, handing over his ID. Charles took it without a smile, his eyes barely flickering up. He tapped at the computer slowly, his lips pursing. "Ah," he said after a pause. "It appears that we may have overbooked. Let me see what I can do." The couple exchanged a glance. The woman's voice was tight. "We booked weeks ago. How is it overbooked?" Charles gave them the same polite, dismissive smirk he had given Shawnee the day before. "These things happen, I'm afraid." Shaq, standing a few feet away, watched everything. He remained by the lounge area, pretending to be on his phone, but his ears were locked onto every word. He saw the hesitation in certain employees' body language, the way they seemed to over-explain policies to certain guests, while others received effortless service. He noticed how guests like him, black men in luxury suits, women like Shawnee, were always met with polite but skeptical smiles, their presence raising unspoken questions. And then, he saw it, the moment that sealed it all. A middle-aged white man in a golf polo stepped up to the counter right after the black couple had been overbooked. "We have a last-minute reservation for the executive suite," he said. Charles, without checking anything in the system, immediately replied, "Ah, yes, of course. Let me get your key." No hesitation, no fake overbooking, no questions. Shaq's fingers tightened around his phone. He had seen enough. Shaq knew blowing up on the spot wouldn't do anything. He had to build his case. So he did what any smart businessman would do. He started talking, listening, asking the right people the right questions. He spoke to a housekeeper, a woman who had worked there for 5 years, who whispered that certain guests got priority cleaning, while others waited twice as long. He casually questioned a young waiter, who admitted that some guests were served with extra attentiveness, while others were subtly ignored. He had a bellhop confirm that complaints about Charles had been handled internally multiple times, always buried. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. And Shaq? He was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Later that evening, Shaq finally approached the front desk. Charles was still there, radiating his usual smug confidence. Shaq placed his credit card down. Checking in for the presidential suite. Charles barely looked up, his fingers hovering over the keyboard lazily. Name? Shaq tilted his head slightly, his deep voice smooth. Michael Reeves. Charles typed in the name, clearly expecting to find an issue. And then, his expression faltered. The reservation was there, paid in full, verified. Charles's eyes flickered up to Shaq, taking in his expensive suit, his massive frame. A shadow of recognition crossed his face, but it didn't click yet. He cleared his throat. See? You'll be staying in the presidential suite? Shaq nodded. Problem? Charles quickly recovered his smugness. Not at all, he said smoothly. It's just that we, usually have high-profile guests in that suite. Shaq raised an eyebrow. High profile? Yes. Charles nodded slowly, clearly testing Shaq. You know, celebrities, CEOs, people of a certain status. Shaq held the butler's gaze. He could have ended it right there, could have dropped his name, watched the color drain from Charles's face. But where was the fun in that? Instead, he gave a slow, amused smirk. Interesting. And with that, he picked up his keycard, turned, and walked toward the elevators, leaving Charles standing there, completely unaware of the storm that was coming. Shaq entered his suite, closing the door behind him. He took out his phone and dialed. A familiar voice picked up. Shaq? Shawnee. I'm here, he said. She exhaled. And? Shaq looked around the suite, the luxury, the privilege, the exclusivity. Then he thought of the black couple who had been denied a room, the staff members afraid to speak out, the waiters, the bellhops, the housekeepers who had whispered the truth. His jaw tightened. You were right, he said finally. This place? It's rotten from the inside. Shawnee was silent for a moment. Then she asked the question she already knew the answer to. What are you gonna do? Shaq's expression was calm, but his voice was firm. I'm gonna teach them a lesson they'll never forget. The Lancaster Grand's executive boardroom was designed to intimidate. It was a vast space of polished mahogany tables, towering glass windows, and an enormous crystal chandelier hanging like a symbol of power. This was where the real decisions were made, away from the eyes of guests, hidden behind layers of exclusivity and control. And tonight, Big Shaq was here to shatter that illusion. The meeting had been arranged under the pretense of a potential investment opportunity. Shaq had deliberately kept his identity vague, ensuring that General Manager Richard Dalton and head butler Charles Wentworth III believed this was a typical business discussion. They had no idea that by the end of this meeting, their world would be turned upside down. As Shaq entered the boardroom, dressed in a dark three-piece suit, his presence was undeniable. Dalton, a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and an overconfident smirk, stood to greet him. Mr. Reeves, I presume? Dalton extended a hand, his smile practiced. Shaq took it, shaking firmly. Something like that. Charles, standing by Dalton's side, still hadn't put the pieces together. He was too focused on the idea of money, and that's exactly what Shaq wanted. As the executives settled into their chairs, Dalton leaned forward, interlocking his fingers. We were quite intrigued when we received your request for a private meeting, he said smoothly. We always welcome high-profile investors who share our standards. Shaq smirked slightly. That's exactly what I want to talk about. Dalton nodded. Excellent. The Lancaster Grand is a premier establishment. Our clientele represents the best of society. Shaq raised an eyebrow. The best? Dalton chuckled, missing the shift in Shaq's tone. Of course. We have certain expectations. Our guests appreciate an environment of class and exclusivity. Shaq leaned back, folding his arms. There it was. The foundation of their discrimination, dressed up as standards. Time to push further. Shaq pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Dalton eyed it suspiciously before flipping it open. Inside were printouts of guest complaints, emails, and internal staff reports, all pointing to a pattern of discrimination. Multiple complaints about Charles treating minority guests differently. Reports of overbooking that only affected certain guests. Secretly recorded testimonies from staff confirming that Dalton had instructed them to prioritize preferred clientele. The color drained from Dalton's face as he flipped through the pages. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This, Dalton forced a chuckle. This is highly misleading. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Is it? Dalton cleared his throat. These are isolated incidents. Any large-scale business occasionally receives complaints. It's nothing more than coincidence. Shaq smirked. So you're saying all these people imagined it? Dalton hesitated. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. Charles finally spoke up, his voice laced with fake confidence. This is nonsense. I have personally ensured that all guests are treated fairly. Shaq chuckled. That so? He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and pressed play. A familiar voice filled the room. Charles's voice. From a recording taken just a day ago. Charles, on recording. We can't just let anyone into the presidential suite. You know how they get. Dalton's eyes went wide. Charles, on recording. The Lancaster Grand has an image to maintain. If we start handing out luxury accommodations to anyone, what's next? Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Charles went pale. Dalton's fingers tightened around the folder, his breath now uneven. Shaq's voice was calm, but his presence dominated the room. You still want to call this a coincidence? Dalton scrambled for control. He forced a smile. Mr. Reeves, surely you understand that in business, perceptions can be twisted. We would never tolerate racism at the Lancaster Grand. Shaq stared at him. Really? He pulled out his phone again and placed it on the table. Dalton frowned. What's this? Shaq leaned in slightly. A live news feed. Dalton hesitated before pressing play. The screen lit up with a breaking news segment. Reporter. We have just received disturbing evidence exposing racial bias at one of the country's most prestigious hotels. Dalton's face froze. Because now? It wasn't just a meeting anymore. It was a public reckoning. Dalton shot up from his seat. You leaked this? Shaq leaned back. I did. Dalton's voice rose with panic. You have no idea what you've done. This hotel has a legacy, a reputation. Shaq's eyes hardened. A reputation for what? Dalton's mouth opened, but no words came out. Charles, still in shock, turned to Dalton. Richard, what do we do? Shaq watched them crumble. I'll tell you what's gonna happen, he said, his voice cool, steady. Dalton whipped around. Shaq stood, buttoning his suit jacket. The world now knows exactly who you are, he said. Which means you have two choices. Dalton swallowed hard. Shaq continued. You can deny everything, call it a misunderstanding. But let's be real. The Lancaster Grand's days are numbered if you do. Dalton's jaw clenched. Or, Shaq continued, you can do what's right. Fire Charles. Step down. Fix what's broken. Dalton's hands curled into fists. He hated that Shaq was right, and Shaq knew it. Shaq turned toward the door, then paused. One last look over his shoulder. I'll be watching, he said, and so will the world. With that, he walked out, leaving behind a boardroom full of men who had just lost everything. The night was quiet at the Lancaster Grand, but inside its towering walls, a storm was brewing. One that no amount of wealth, exclusivity, or corporate power could contain. And at the center of it all? Big Shaq, playing his final move. Hours before dawn, Shaq sat in his private suite, his phone placed on the sleek marble table in front of him. The screen displayed a single audio file, its waveform flickering softly. The evidence was undeniable. He pressed play. Richard Dalton's voice came through first. Calm, arrogant, dripping with entitlement. Dalton. Let's be honest, Charles. We don't run a charity. If we start treating certain guests like VIPs, we'll lose our real clientele. Then came Charles's smug chuckle. Charles, you mean the ones who don't know their place? Trust me, I made sure that woman, what was her name, Shawnee, understood exactly where she stood. Shaq's jaw tightened. The recording continued. Dalton. Good. The Lancaster Grand is about class, not basketball wives trying to act like royalty. A long silence. Then, the sound of glasses clinking. Two men toasting their shared ideology. Shaq inhaled slowly, controlling his anger. This wasn't just about Shawnee anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been denied, dismissed, or degraded behind closed doors. And now, the doors were about to be blown wide open. The world woke up to a scandal. At exactly 6 a.m., Shaq's anonymous account posted the recording on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, with a simple caption. This is what happens behind closed doors at the Lancaster Grand. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Jasmine NYC. Wow, I've stayed at this hotel before. Always felt the energy was off. This confirms it. Cancel Lancaster Grand. Our justice for all. Imagine paying thousands for luxury just to be treated like you're nothing. This is disgusting. Hoops King 23. And they had the audacity to talk about Shaq's wife like this? Oh, it's over. Forbes Business. Breaking. Audio footage reveals systemic discrimination at the Lancaster Grand. Investors react negatively as stocks plummet. Within 2 hours, the hashtag # shut down Lancaster was trending #1 worldwide. By 8 a.m., major news outlets had picked up the story. By 9 a.m., the hotel's biggest investors were pulling out. By 10 a.m., the Lancaster Grand was in full-scale panic mode. At 10:30 a.m., Richard Dalton sat at the head of a massive crisis meeting, his once perfectly groomed hair now slightly disheveled. The boardroom, normally a place of calm and control, was in chaos. Executives yelled over each other, some on their phones with legal teams, others pacing furiously. Investor representative. This is a PR nightmare. We've lost over $200 million in market value in 4 hours. Legal advisor. If we don't act now, we could be facing multiple lawsuits. Dalton slammed a fist on the table. This is an attack, he snapped. Someone is trying to ruin us. Then, the doors swung open, and Big Shaq walked in. Silence. Dalton's face drained of color. Charles, for the first time in his life, was speechless. Shaq stepped forward, unbuttoning his suit jacket, his expression unreadable. Then, he pulled out his phone, pressed play, and let the recording fill the room. Dalton's own words spilled into the air like poison, the same arrogance, the same racism, now an inescapable reality. When the recording ended, Shaq pocketed his phone and leaned forward. Now, he said, his voice calm but deadly. What were you saying about an attack? Dalton opened his mouth. No words came out. Shaq nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Shaq took his time, letting the weight of the silence sink in. Then he spoke. This is what's going to happen, he said. Dalton flinched, as if the decision wasn't already made for him. Shaq held up a finger. 1. You, Richard, you're stepping down, effective immediately. Dalton's hands curled into fists, but he knew he had no choice. 2. Shaq turned his gaze to Charles. You, fired, on the spot. Charles stammered. You can't. Shaq cut him off with a sharp glare. I just did. Charles sank back into his chair, face pale. Shaq straightened. And 3. This hotel? It's gonna change. The days of running a place that caters to your kind of luxury? He smirked. They're over. By noon, the news was official. Richard Dalton resigns amid scandal. Charles Wentworth fired for discriminatory behavior. Hotel under investigation for systemic racism. By 3 p.m., major corporations cut ties with the Lancaster Grand, citing its inexcusable practices. By sunset, The once prestigious hotel stood on the brink of collapse, and by midnight, the world knew exactly who to thank for it. Big Shaq. The man who didn't just fight back, he changed the game. The storm had passed, but its impact still echoed through the walls of the Lancaster Grand. The world had seen the truth, the discrimination, the corruption, the toxic elitism that had defined the hotel's culture for years. The public had spoken. But Shaq? He knew that taking down the corrupt leaders wasn't enough. Real change meant building something better in its place. And that's exactly what he was about to do. A crowd of journalists, employees, and former guests gathered in the hotel's grand ballroom, a space that had once only hosted the elite. Now, it was filled with the people who actually mattered. Shaq stood at the podium, dressed in a sleek navy suit, his towering presence commanding attention without saying a word. He adjusted the microphone, scanning the room. Then, he spoke. For too long, the Lancaster Grand operated under the belief that luxury is only for some people. The room fell silent. That ends today. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled notes. Cameras flashed. Shaq continued. Real power isn't about owning buildings, controlling wealth, or choosing who gets treated with dignity. He paused, his voice steady. Real power is using what you have to create change. He took a deep breath, then laid out the 3 major reforms that would reshape the hotel forever. Effective immediately, every single staff member, from the front desk to the boardroom, will undergo mandatory diversity and inclusion training. Some executives shifted in their seats. Shaq glanced at them. He had their attention now. This isn't about checking a box. This is about understanding the people you serve. He gestured toward the audience. Because they are the reason this hotel exists, not some outdated notion of exclusivity. Applause erupted from the back of the room. Shaq smiled. Step 1, done. Shaq pulled out a file and opened it. In my time here, I've met some incredible employees, he said. People who have worked harder than anyone, yet never got the promotions they deserved. He paused. Then, he turned to a familiar face in the audience. Derek, the bellhop. Derek. Derek's eyes widened. Me? Shaq nodded. You've been here for 3 years, right? Derek nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Shaq smiled. Not anymore. The room fell silent. Because starting today, you're the new guest experience manager. Gasps filled the ballroom. Derek looked stunned. Sir, I don't know what to say. Shaq chuckled. Say yes, man. Derek grinned, tears forming in his eyes. Yes. The crowd cheered. And just like that, the hotel had its first real leader. Shaq's expression darkened slightly as he looked toward the executive table. This place needs more than new policies. His voice was calm, but unshakable. It needs new leadership. All eyes turned to Richard Dalton, who sat at the far end of the table, his face pale. Shaq stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Dalton could hear. You know what to do. Dalton swallowed hard. After a long pause, he stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the exit, without a word. The moment the doors closed behind him, a wave of relief swept through the employees. The dictator was gone. And in his place, a fresh start. As the conference wrapped up, Shawnee stood near the back of the room, watching it all unfold. She hadn't said much. She had let Shaq take the lead, let him fight this battle in his own way. But as she watched Derek hug his coworkers, watched employees finally feel valued, watched guests nod in approval, something inside her broke. Tears welled up in her eyes. Shaq turned and saw her. He stepped off the stage, walking toward her. Shawnee? She let out a shaky laugh, wiping her face. I'm fine. She looked up at him, her voice thick with emotion. I thought this would be about revenge. Shaq frowned. It never was. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I know, she whispered. And that's why I'm so damn proud of you. Shaq pulled her into a hug, resting his forehead against hers. This wasn't about winning. It was about changing lives. And they had done just that. Months later, the Lancaster Grand had transformed. More diversity in leadership. Employees from all backgrounds finally had a voice. No more gatekeeping. The hotel welcomed all guests with the same level of respect. Profits soared because people now wanted to stay there. And at the entrance, where a certain snobbish butler once stood, a plaque now read, "Luxury is not about who you keep out. It's about how you make people feel." Signed, Shaquille O'Neal. One afternoon, Shawnee and Shaq walked through the newly transformed hotel. As they approached the check-in desk, a young black woman in a business suit was speaking with the front desk agent. She smiled warmly. "No rush, ma'am. Take your time. We're happy to have you here." Shawnee exhaled slowly, taking it all in. Shaq wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "See?" he murmured. "Told you. We didn't need revenge." Shawnee smiled up at him. "No," she agreed. "We needed this." As they walked out, they knew this wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was proof that real change was possible, and that was the greatest victory of all. The private jet glided smoothly through the clouds, leaving the chaos of the past few weeks far behind. Shaq sat comfortably in one of the leather recliners, his 7 feet 1 inch frame finally at ease, a rare sight for a man always on the move. Across from him, Shawnee gazed out the window, watching the sun sink beneath the horizon, casting golden hues over the endless sky. For the first time in a long time, it was just them. No cameras, no headlines, no battles to fight, just Shaq and Shawnee. And yet, as peaceful as the flight was, Shaq knew something was still weighing on her mind. "Where are we going?" Shawnee finally asked, tilting her head curiously. Shaq smirked. "You'll see." Minutes later, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Mr. O'Neal, we'll be landing shortly. Your suite is ready." Shawnee raised an eyebrow. "Suite?" The jet landed on a private island, where a sleek high-end resort stood nestled between white sandy beaches and lush green landscapes. As they stepped off the plane, a line of staff members greeted them with warm smiles and genuine enthusiasm. Not forced, not performative. Real. Shawnee looked around, then back at Shaq. "You did all this?" Shaq smiled softly. "Nah, they did." The resort wasn't owned by him. It wasn't his business venture or another investment. It was a place that thrived on inclusion, fairness, and real hospitality. And today, it was the perfect reminder of what true luxury should feel like. Later that evening, Shaq and Shawnee sat on a private deck overlooking the ocean, soft waves crashing against the shore. A full moon hung in the sky, its reflection shimmering over the water. Shawnee sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "You're quiet," Shaq noted. She exhaled. "I've just been thinking." Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "About what?" Shawnee looked at him, her eyes filled with something deeper than pride, something heavier. "Everything," she admitted. "How far we've come. How much we've had to fight just to exist in spaces like that hotel." Shaq nodded slowly. Shawnee took a breath. "But Shaq, at any point, did it ever feel like you weren't fighting for justice?" He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "Like, part of you wanted revenge?" Shaq studied her, his gaze thoughtful. Then he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. "Maybe, at first," he admitted. "When I saw what they did to you. Yeah, I wanted to make them pay." Shawnee squeezed his hand gently. "But then I realized something," he continued. "Power isn't about winning fights. It's about changing lives." Shawnee's eyes welled with tears. That's what made Shaq different. That's why he had done what no one else could. Shawnee looked at the man sitting across from her. The icon, the mogul, the leader. But she also saw the young man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. The flashbacks came rushing in like waves. The early days when Shaq was a rising star, unsure if he would ever make it big. The nights when they counted every dollar, making sure they had enough for rent. The first time Shaq bought her something extravagant, and she almost cried because she had never imagined having that kind of life. The people who had looked down on them, who had dismissed them, who had tried to push them out. And now, they had built an empire. But more than that, they had built a legacy. A tear slipped down Shawnee's cheek before she could stop it. Shaq reached over, brushing it away with his thumb. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, laughing through the emotion. "Yeah, just really proud of you." Shaq smiled, his expression full of love. "We did this together, Shawnee." She smiled back. "Yeah, we did." The next morning, as they were checking out, the resort's general manager approached them. He was a tall black man in his late 40s, well-dressed but approachable, his warm smile radiating confidence. "Mr. and Mrs. O'Neill," he greeted. "It's an honor having you here." Shaq nodded. "Beautiful place you got here." The man smiled. "I appreciate that, but I should probably introduce myself properly." He extended his hand. "My name is Aaron Bishop. We actually met before." Shaq frowned slightly, shaking his hand. "We have?" Aaron chuckled. "Yeah, but back then, I wasn't running a resort. I was parking cars at one. Shawnee's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" Aaron nodded. "Years ago, I worked valet at a 5-star hotel in Miami. It was one of those places where they treated certain people like they didn't belong." He shook his head. "One night I parked your car, Shaq. I remember because you were the only guest who talked to me like I was a person." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Man, I was just being normal." Aaron smiled. "Not to them, you weren't." Shaq and Shawnee exchanged a look. Aaron continued. "That night, after my shift, you handed me a $500 tip and said, 'You're better than this place.'" Shaq blinked. Aaron chuckled. "You probably don't even remember, but I do. That night I went home and applied for business school." Shawnee covered her mouth. "And now?" Aaron gestured around them. "I own this place." Shaq stared at him for a long moment. Then a slow grin spread across his face. "That's what I'm talking about." Aaron laughed, shaking his head. "You changed my life, man. And now, I get to do the same for others." Shaq nodded, feeling something deep in his chest. Because this was exactly why he did what he did. As Shaq and Shawnee walked toward the jet, hand in hand, Shawnee glanced up at him. "You really didn't remember him?" she asked. Shaq shook his head. "Nah, but that's the thing, Shawnee." She tilted her head. "What?" Shaq looked toward the ocean, the sun reflecting off the water. "You never know who you're helping when you do the right thing." Shawnee smiled, because that was the truth. Shaq hadn't set out to change one man's life all those years ago. But in doing so, he had created a ripple effect. And now, that ripple had turned into a wave. As the jet took off, Shaq and Shawnee knew. This wasn't just about one hotel, one fight, one moment. It was about all the lives they would continue to change. The Lancaster Grand was no longer the same hotel. Gone were the days of elitist gatekeeping, whispered biases, and exclusion disguised as luxury. It had been 6 months since Shaq took over, 6 months since the world watched the downfall of an empire built on discrimination. Now, it was an empire rebuilt on respect, fairness, and true hospitality. And today, everyone was about to witness it firsthand. The Grand Lobby, once a place where only certain guests were welcomed with warmth, now buzzed with an authentic, inclusive energy. Guests of all backgrounds checked in without hesitation, greeted with genuine smiles. Employees who had once been ignored now held positions of leadership. The once rigid, elitist atmosphere had been replaced with true 5-star service, where luxury wasn't about exclusion, but experience. The new CEO, Jordan Wells, a sharp, ambitious leader personally chosen by Shaq, stood at the center of it all, overseeing the final touches before today's big event. Because today, Shaq was coming back. And with him, the final lesson. The cameras were set up. Reporters, business leaders, and guests gathered in the ballroom, waiting for the biggest moment in the hotel's history. And then, the doors opened. Shaq walked in, slow and steady, his towering presence commanding attention. Every eye turned toward him. The room fell silent. He stepped up to the podium. The cameras zoomed in. And then, he spoke. 6 months ago, this hotel stood for the wrong things. He let the words settle. It stood for privilege over fairness, appearance over character, power over people. A pause. But now, He looked around, scanning the room. The employees who had been promoted, the guests who were treated as equals, the journalists who had exposed the truth. Now the Lancaster Grand is what it always should have been, a place where everyone is welcome. The room erupted in applause, but Shaq wasn't done, because there was one last thing left to do. A side door opened, and in walked Charles Wentworth III, the butler who had humiliated Shawnee, the man whose arrogance had started it all. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked smaller, his posture tense. He had been forced to watch the hotel transform without him. Shaq turned to him, microphone still in hand. "Charles," he said evenly. The camera zoomed in on the butler's rigid face. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. "The world knows what you did. But more importantly, you know what you did." A long pause. Charles looked down, for the first time truly ashamed. Shaq folded his arms. "So let's make this official." He turned to the new CEO, Jordan. "Mr. Wells, as of today, is Charles still employed at the Lancaster Grand?" Jordan took a deep breath and looked straight at Charles. "No, he is not." The words rang through the ballroom. A final statement, a final reminder. That discrimination has no place in hospitality. The cameras captured every second, and the world watched. Shawnee stood at the back of the ballroom, watching everything unfold. She had been quiet all morning, observing, absorbing. Now, as she saw Charles walking out of the hotel, powerless, and Shaq standing at the podium, a leader, not just a fighter, she exhaled deeply. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about building something better. Shaq had won, but not in the way they expected. He had transformed an entire institution. And Shawnee? For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She didn't need to say anything. She just smiled. Because she knew. Her husband didn't just fight back. He built something that would last. As the event ended, Shaq took a slow walk through the hotel lobby, the same place where it all started. The golden chandeliers reflected off the marble floors, the scent of fresh flowers filling the air. But this time, there was no tension, no whispers, no judgment, just a hotel that truly lived up to its reputation. Shaq paused for a moment, hands in his pockets, taking it all in. A guest passed by, an older black couple, checking in for their anniversary weekend. They looked at Shaq, recognition in their eyes. The man smiled. "Thank you for this." Shaq smiled back. "Enjoy your stay." And with that, he stepped outside, the sun shining brightly, the world moving forward. Because now, his legacy was beyond basketball. It was about real change, and that was the greatest victory of all. Your voice matters. Be part of the change. This wasn't just Shaq's story. It's a story about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. Injustice still exists, but real change happens when we stand up, speak out, and demand better. What would you have done in Shaq's place? Have you ever faced unfair treatment? How did you handle it? Drop a comment, share this story, and let's keep the conversation going. Join the movement. Share your story. Be the change.